Welcome to the latest in the NCTJ's Summer School series. I'm Gore, Head of Partnerships and Projects at the NCTJ. I used to be Executive Editor at The Independent, and before that I started my career working in media regulation for the Press Complaints Commission. Today's topic is media ethics. There's a famous epigram about the media in this country. You cannot hope to bribe or twist, thank God, the British journalist. But seeing what the man will do unbribed, there's no occasion to. This was written by Humber Wolf in 1930, which is a good indicator that debates about journalism ethics are about as old as journalism itself. Generally speaking, these debates go in cycles, coming to a head every now and again when a particularly egregious practice comes to light, or a one-off case of journalistic misbehaviour brings the profession into disrepute. In recent years, the ethics of British journalism have come under the microscope as a result of the phone hacking scandal, which was exposed, largely by journalists of course, between 2005 and 2011. The revelation of illegal activity by journalists at the News of the World led to the establishment of a judge-led investigation, the Leveson Inquiry. Several journalists were subsequently charged, the News of the World closed down, and related legal cases concerning several newspapers continue still to rumble on. It ought to go without saying that illegality has no place in the practice of journalism. But questions of journalistic ethics go beyond the general law. Even if what you're doing is legal, it may not be acceptable. This is why responsible news media organisations follow additional codes of practice or conduct. Some of those codes have been developed by specific companies to guide their own staff. Others apply to a group of organisations which have all agreed to be bound by common rules. Most codes tend to follow very similar ground because they're rooted in the same ethical considerations. As a journalist, it's important to know what the codes say so that you don't fall foul of them, causing trouble for yourself and for the organisation that you work for. Most newspapers and their websites follow the editor's code of practice. This code is overseen by an organisation called the Independent Press Standards Organisation, or IPSO. Some mostly smaller publishers are members of an alternative regulatory body called Impress, the Independent Monitor for the Press, which is a slightly different code. A few digital and print-focused news organisations don't subscribe to either of these bodies. The Financial Times, The Independent, Private Eye, The Guardian are a few examples. Most have their own ethical rules of practice that their journalists are expected to follow. For broadcasters, things are a little bit different. They are, as a requirement, regulated by an organisation called Ofcom, the Office of Communications, which was established by law. It has stricter rules on news programmes being politically impartial, among other things. It also has the power to revoke a TV or radio station's operating licence. Newspapers and news websites don't need a licence to operate. Yet while there are key differences between these regulatory models, there is more about them which is similar than sets them apart. So what are the main things that journalists should do if they want to follow the ethical guidelines which these various codes lay down? The first thing ought to be obvious. Do your utmost to be accurate. This doesn't mean that you won't sometimes get something wrong. Every journalist has done that at some point, to a greater or lesser extent. But the point is you must take care to avoid being inaccurate. And then if you do make a mistake, you must correct it. How does a journalist go about trying to establish the facts? Sometimes it's easy. You can report on what you have seen with your own eyes and can therefore vouch for. At other times, you'll be telling your readers or your viewers what another named individual has seen. Then, assuming that your source is known to be reliable, you'll be on fairly safe ground. Likewise, There are some facts which are widely known to be true and don't need to be double-checked. But a lot of the time, when journalists are reporting on events, they might not have the whole picture, at least to begin with. Someone may tell you something, but in many cases you can't just assume that it's true. After all, people have all sorts of reasons, both for telling outright lies and for giving only a partial version of events. A responsible ethical reporter must make further checks to find out for themselves, perhaps by speaking to more people, or checking with official sources, or perhaps examining publicly available data. In the end, being accurate is the number one mark of a good news journalist. And when you're not sure, either don't go ahead with the story, or tell your audience why you're not sure. Better to be truthful about what you know and what you don't know than to make assumptions and hope for the best. The second big ethical issue that confronts journalists is about how their work affects the privacy of the people they write or talk about. And this is frequently more complicated than simply getting your facts straight. It's complex because it brings into conflict two competing sets of rights. First, the rights of a journalist to publicise important information. Second, the rights of an individual to keep personal information to themselves. When that happens, journalists must be very careful only to reveal details that can be justified in what is called the public interest. But even this doesn't make things easy, because defining the public interest is quite tricky. The codes I've already mentioned tend to talk about material being in the public interest if it prevents people from being misled, for example, or exposes wrongdoing. So, for instance, if a famous sports person endorses a product which publicly he or she says is brilliant, it would be in the public interest to reveal that they told their mates in the pub that the product was rubbish, even though they'd said it in a private conversation. Still, understanding what kind of information is private, and when it can, in spite of that fact, be revealed, is vital for journalists. Making the wrong call can be hugely costly. If in doubt, leave it out. Some groups of people have more privacy rights than others. In particular, children have greater protection. Journalists mustn't generally talk to children under 16 about issues to do with their welfare unless their parents agree. Likewise, interviewing, photographing, or filming is more or less off limits in hospitals in order to protect vulnerable people. Broadly speaking, the more vulnerable an individual is, the more they will be shielded by the rules of best practice. Likewise, regulations across all platforms offer protection for individuals against discrimination on the grounds of race, religion, colour, sexuality, gender, or disability. Such characteristics cannot be held up to prejudicial reporting, and in fact must not be mentioned at all unless they are actually relevant to what's being reported. For example, if a person talks publicly about how they came out to their friends or family, say, it's obvious that the coverage would mention their sexuality. That's the whole point. But if someone is on trial for robbery, there's no justification for mentioning their sexuality, whatever it may be, or indeed any of the other characteristics that I've mentioned, unless for some reason the fact was important to the case and perhaps was discussed in the court. Other important ethical rules guide journalists in how they go about obtaining information. For instance, unless there are very good reasons to, you should always be open about who you are, the fact you're a journalist, and who you work for. If you get information from someone by pretending to be something that you're not, you might find in the end that you can't use the material when it comes to writing your story. And even if you don't use it, you could get in trouble for misrepresenting yourself. Similarly, you can't keep badgering someone for answers to your questions if they've told you clearly that they don't want to speak to you. Carrying on once you've been told to stop can quickly turn into harassment. All of this might make it seem as if there are lots of obstacles in the path of journalists who are just trying to get a good story. But the fact is, the news media has a lot of power and a good deal of freedom. It's important that journalists exercise that power responsibly in order that their freedom is not compromised or curtailed. After all, there are plenty of people out there who would rather that journalists weren't asking difficult questions. So, good journalism is ethical journalism. In the long run, knowing the rules and regulations will stand you in excellent stead. For more information about how to get into journalism, visit www.nctj.com.